is lust? How do you deal with it? I'm Dr. Carol. Thank you for joining me on this episode. We're talking about that, you bet. Lust is a word that has, first of all, developed a sexualized meaning, and that can be a core. But what this gets us into is about a lot more than sex. In this conversation with my guest today, Jay Haug, we'll unpack his story of dealing with lust, and then we're going to get really specific about what lust is, how that relates to sexual desire. How do you learn to, well, like God intended, have healthy sexual desire, but not give in to lust? What even does that look like? How can that be? Jay Haug has walked this road himself. He graduated from Williams College and then Virginia Theological Seminary. Then he went to England and got diplomas from the University of Nottingham and St. John's College in Nottingham. He worked as an Episcopal priest for quite some period of time. He's had several other roles, and now, for the last 25 years, he has been working in addiction recovery, helping other guys deal with their lust. That's a snapshot of a much longer story that I will have Jay unpack more directly with you. I know this will both challenge and encourage you if lust is something you're dealing with. Jay Haug, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you on the program today. Thank you. First of all, I know you're going to share some of your story. We're honored, and then the work that you do. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Carol. It's so great to be here and to have a chance to talk about things that are so important
Yeah,
and so vital in people's healing and hope.
yeah. Um, we're going there in this conversation, and I'm glad you said healing and hope. So many people who are wrestling with the things we're going to talk about feel like they're stuck, feel like there's no hope. And your story as one human and the work that you do with many others shows that you don't have to be stuck. To get started, about your story, you came to the work that you do in many ways out of your story. God usually does that. So
Yeah.
tell us a bit.
Yes. Well, my story is I grew up in New England, in a very traditional family. My parents were both Ivy League graduates, believed in education. But part of that culture was that I was sent off to both boarding school and summer camps. And I had two unfortunate incidents which kind of set the tone. And this is pretty common among guys that are in recovery. When I was 8, I was physically abused at a summer camp publicly. And that was the years after the war when this probably camp counselor decided he was going to instill discipline in the young men who was at this camp. And then unfortunately, I went to another camp, which was a choir camp, and I was sexually abused at age 11.
Mm.
So I had a lot of pain and stuff that I didn't know how to deal with, and a lot of sexualization early. And I often say that the enemy got started early. I became a Christian when I was 18. So if you count the years from 8 to 18 or 11 to 18, I had a way of thinking of the world and of reacting to the world in a highly sexualized manner
Yeah.
that was pretty much in an established rut before God even had a chance to get a hold of me. So part of that, and as we know, we have life is lived forward, but it's understood backwards.
Mm.
And so we don't know what we don't know. And I didn't know that I was a lust addict. I didn't know it.
Wow.
I used pornography in my teenage years, of all kinds. And then it went into triple X movies and uh, videos. And I always thought that that would be the limit of it. It shows you my level of misunderstanding of what
Mm.
lust is.
Mm.
And then eventually, I did become a clergyman. I went to seminary and was ordained. I was served in several parishes. And then at the age of 42, I confessed to my wife that I had been sexually unfaithful to her on two occasions.
Mm.
And that kind of brought our world down.
Yeah.
And the world before and after that is the BC and AD of my life is was when I turned 42 and the truth came out and I suddenly realized I had to live in a different world.
Yeah.
The
One thing,
marriage that
Jay, yeah,
yes,
one thing about all that, Jay, what you have illustrated in just a couple minutes is you didn't wake up one day and decide I'm going to get hooked on porn or I'm going to have affairs on my wife or I'm going to destroy my marriage or my relationship with God. It came from somewhere. It's not that there's no responsibility, but you were sinned against and then you sinned in
yes,
response. Don't you think that's the pretty normal story?
absolutely is. I would say, you know, when we founded Living Without Lust, which is our nonprofit, we did it with three or four guys who were from SA. We members of SA, Sexaholics Anonymous, and within that fellowship, I think the early childhood abuse and trauma is way up in the 80 to 90%. There are
Mm.
a few that didn't get started until they were adults, but most of us were, as I say, we were wrecked early,
Mm.
and we had to find a way to find healing and wholeness as we went along.
Yeah. What did that do when your world came down at 42 to your perception of life, of God, of yourself? Um, you know, breaking apart at the seams, so to speak. But just a moment of what that D Day was like.
Yes. Well, I remember I didn't know what to do when everything came out. I had to resign from my church. I was separated in essence from my wife. I went down to a 2 week program in St. Petersburg called or Clearwater called the Christian Care Center. I remember driving down there and waves of weeping had come over me as I realized the devastation that had finally come out. And I remember hearing the voice of God, and He said to me, "Everything is going to be okay."
Mm.
And it was at that moment that I realized that the the love of God, the sovereignty of God, the purpose of God, and the hope of God are greater than my circumstances. And that
Mm.
as painful as they were, and as much as I had to work through all of that in the weeks and months and years to follow, um, I always held on to that word as a way to live in hope. So my sister called me. I remember she called me and she said, "Well, how's your faith? You know, have you lost your faith?" And I said, "No, I haven't lost my faith. My faith is unshakable. What I'm coming out of is hurt and woundedness and betrayal, my own betrayal of my wife and others. And that's what I have to work through, but I've not lost my faith. And so what I found is over time is that my faith deepened.
Mm.
It the scars and the wounds, the purpose of those, and I think sometimes we don't ask that question. We say, well, how can I get over this?
Yeah.
How can I get through it? How can I move beyond it?
Yeah.
But I think part of what God did in me was He said, I'm going to remake you as a different person through the wounds that you are experiencing. And you will become a wounded healer because of this. You'll
Wow.
become partners with me in helping those who struggle to find restoration.
Yeah. Beautiful, Jay. Beautiful. You may hear something that I hear fairly regularly, especially from guys who write to me. And it's something like I hear it from women too, but especially guys. I have prayed and prayed and prayed for God to fix me. I prayed for Him to remove my desire for porn. I prayed for Him to take away my sexual desire as a whole. Why isn't He helping me?
Right.
What do you say to that kind of struggle?
So here's the problem. The problem is not just lust, it's the lifestyle of secrecy, isolation, aloneness, self deception. As I said, we don't know what we don't know. And so, how are we going to become different people? What's the different lifestyle look? And it is coming out of fighting, it's coming out of secrecy, it's coming into fellowship, sharing our own story, taking the risk of doing that, and hearing other people's stories to which we can identify that brings about the healing. So when I hear but think people say things, well, I've read my Bible, I've prayed, I've done this, I've done that. We're that reflects an individualistic lifestyle. And that is not the solution, it is the problem. So the whole idea of healing in fellowship and in community is something we need to embrace. And I see this all the time, guys who can't stay sober. And you ask them, well, are you making phone calls to people in your fellowship? Are you talking with your sponsor? Are you actually doing service in your recovery group to help others get sober? And if it's no, no, and no, then we have a problem that's bigger than lust, don't we?
Yes, yes. Um, and I'm glad you said that, because when I talk to people about finding connection, that's almost always the biggest struggle that they have. But I will say, and you may be able to verify this, I have yet to meet somebody who has had a deep sexually related struggle with lust or some variety of that, who has not found, who has found long-term healing without deeply connecting with a few others. You just can't do it any other way.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And this isolation framework is very, very hard to break because it is often ingrained from childhood. It's a way of coping. We had a conference, a men's conference this year, and we had Matt Wenger from Boulder Recovery, Begin
Mm,
Again.
yeah.
And I had always thought that my mantra, here's the lies we tell ourselves. The 8-year-old and 11-year-old Jay told this lie. I'm all on my own. I have no one to help me.
Yes.
And so Matt came and he said, remarkably, every single sex addict I've ever counseled has said, I'm on my own. There is no one to help me. So apparently I'm not alone in this struggle.
Yes.
And we again, it's like the two fish swimming in the ocean, and one says to the other one, how do you like the water? And the other one says, what water?
Yep.
There's
Yep.
no knowledge of the area we swim in. And until we look at it and we say, gosh, look at me. I've been living an isolated life, and
Mhm.
that needs to change. It's not just, we say it's not just about not doing it.
Yes.
It's becoming a new person and having new relationships, new honesty, new transparency, etc.
Yes. Powerful. Well, you didn't stay there. You're older than 42, and you have now been helping other guys for 25 plus years in overcoming the struggle. Um, Talk a bit about how your life has unfolded since D-Day.
Well, I didn't have a straight line, and I was very much a holdout
That's good.
because of this idea that I couldn't live without my addiction. So, and when I got back from the Christian Care Center in Clearwater, I went to another S program, then went into SA, and I was working my own little program within SA, which was I don't want to have any more affairs. And so I didn't. And I spent about 10 years in SA, and I thought, well, I've achieved my goal. And so I quit. And that was about the time that internet porn, high-speed internet porn came out in the early 2000s.
Mm,
And when it was available at work, I crashed and I was binging on it and so on. And that went on for several years. The secrecy went on for several years. And finally, um, my wife intervened because she found something in my pocket was like a pornographic thumbnail sketch. And she said, what's this?
mm,
And at that moment, I went running back to SA and I got really honest and I decided to work the SA program as the SA program. And I got sober.
mm,
And I was sober for almost 8 years. And then my character defects of entitlement and minimization took hold. And I started lusting in my head. I
mm,
wasn't looking at porn, but I was lusting in my head. And so after some uh, setbacks there and greater honesty and transparency, and actually my wife intervening on me again, I went ahead and reset and started working on my internal life. So all of that is part of my story, and all of that is the ongoing part. I mean, we read last night in our meeting, we read about the AA, because SA comes out of
Yep.
AA, and it
Yep.
says, I have an alcoholic mind. Okay. So we translate that I have a sexaholic mind.
Mhm.
So if I expect my mind to figure it out, it's not going to figure it out. I need a higher power. I need God. I need Jesus to help me, to give me a different perspective.
Yeah.
And so I often work steps 1, 2, 3 every day, just on the lust piece to make sure it's in the right place.
Mhm.
And then, of course, 9 years ago, we started living without lust, and that was to go up the food chain into the church and to help not only continue to help guides who struggle, but also work with Christian leaders to become resource people and highly sensitized to the need to help people who struggle this way. Because, as you know, the clergyman often or clergy person often gets the first call.
Yeah. Yes. And this is not a problem that does not impact clergy, as your own story
Yes,
illustrates. You can be speaking in God's name every week, and you are still burdened yourself as well
yes.
as the people you have been given to serve. You've used a word several times, and the ministry that you had, living without lust, the lust word. Um, I don't want to bypass that.
Mm,
I want to just park on that for a minute and have you kind of parse that out. I think some people, when they hear lust, may think, "Oh, I I'm horny. I want sex."
yes.
But in marriage, God's way, you are coming together. It's part of the one flesh union. How do you parse that out?
Yes. Well, I think we first have to understand what lust is. And Jesus is the one who speaks of it. He speaks of it in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:27 and 28. And you know, the atmosphere of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus is restoring the law to its God intended purpose, which is spiritual and in the heart. I went back and read a lot of the law of Moses and the Torah, and there's a lot about the heart in there. But by the time Jesus comes on the scene, the Pharisees have basically eviscerated that into some kind of outward performance. And so the context of his speaking about lust is adultery. And essentially, he's saying, you focus on the behavior, which is adultery.
Yeah.
But I say to you that if a man lusts after a woman, he's already committed adultery with her in his heart. Okay. So the issue is the heart, because as Proverbs tells us, if you think about something in your heart or in your mind, it's going to come out into your actions, right?
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah.
So that's the root cause of the problem. So the unity, say, of the SA fellowship was that we focus on lust as the unifying factor, not the divisive factor. So if somebody has same-sex lust, it's the same thing. It's lust. So it is the desire to objectify and use another human being for our own selfish purposes. That would be my thumbnail definition of lust.
Yeah,
And so,
that's good, Jay. I just want to interject. It also makes me think of that scripture in James. I'm forgetting chapter and verse. You desire that you may have so that you may consume it upon your lusts. And it wasn't even necessarily sexual, although it can be the desire that I want what I want for my own purposes.
yes, exactly. It is a more pervasive, and that's why we say that healing is not just the healing of sexual lust, but it's how all these desires that come up from time to time. And I've said on a number of occasions that desire is one of the greatest God-given gifts that we have, and it is also the thing that the enemy hates the most
Mm,
about human beings,
mm,
because desire is uh, related to creativity. It is related to love. It's related to sacrifice and service and glorifying God and even worship. So
yes,
desire in and of itself, and there are many scriptures that talk about desire
yes,
as a positive thing. So what we have to understand is that our desires have been hijacked by the enemy to try to turn us away from the creativity. I noticed you had Kurt Thompson,
yes,
and Kurt, he's wonderful on this whole thing that we are
yes,
we are destined to create beauty, whether it's writing, whether it's art, whether it's service, whether it's um, some kind of connection with others. We are made for this, but the enemy wants to hijack it. So, how do we stay focused on positive desire and not lust. Okay. And a lot of it is related to what we've already said, and that is in the marriage bed. And Hebrews talks about don't let the marriage bed become defiled, right? And this is in recovery. Sometimes people who are married have a more difficult time because the single people, if they're surrendering sexual relations, um, they're not having to be confronted with what lust may be lying within their sexuality as
Mm,
probably as much as probably married people do.
wow.
So how do we do that? We do it by um, staying having the sexuality part come emanate out of the relationship. So we're intimate non-sexually with our partner. We're exercising forgiveness. We are sharing things. We're asking them. We're listening to them, wanting to know what they themselves want and desire. And out of that, the sexual relationship becomes a reflection of that. And so if we're involved in those kinds of things, then lust has no place. We can
Mm,
talk about how it can insert itself in that as well. But um, if we develop the relationship and then the sexual relationship becomes an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual reality,
yeah.
then we're beginning to get on the right track. But this is not an easy thing, and a lot of guys in recovery struggle with it because the way our brains have been wired.
I am so glad you brought up about lust in the marriage bed. Um, I think in the church, married people feel like, oh, it's now legal, so I can do what I want, or use First Corinthians, the early part of First Corinthians 7 as a weapon. Um, and that's all about lust.
Yes.
I also just wanted to make a comment on your thoughts about desire. Christopher West, in commenting on St. Paul II's theology of the body, said Jesus did not come to squelch eros, but to redeem it. That
Yes.
little line has just stuck in my brain.
Yes. Another one from Christopher West in translation of Pope John Paul was pornography is wrong not because it shows too much, but because it shows too little.
Yes.
And so we're back to the objectification thing, that this person whom God has created in his image, and from a man's perspective, God's daughter, God's precious daughter, is being used as a thing, and we become consumers rather than someone to hold in the marriage bed, someone precious in God's sight, and to take care of this fragile soul that God has um, committed to our charge in marriage.
You have walked a long journey in learning that. I know many of the guys that you serve are too. Talk a little bit about how somebody can learn to do that, to have their sexuality come out of relationship rather than sex being about lust. Um, I'm sure that's the multi-year journey, but talk for a minute about what that process is to learn that.
Yes, it is a difficult process, and sometimes guys need a some kind of a format. In other words, we're not used to talking about feelings. We're not used to listening
Yeah, yeah.
and really hearing. And so sometimes we encourage guys to use the Fanos. I think this came out of the lasers, feelings, affirmations, needs, ownership, and sobriety, where we don't interrupt each other. We allow the person to go through this, and it could take 10, 15, 20 minutes. We're really taking in what they are saying to us, and then we're sharing our own needs. But any kind of way that we can um, listen, affirm, care, make time for each other, be quiet in each other's presence, um, pray together. Anytime the man can take initiative spiritually, the man is meant to take initiative spiritually. I think that's what every woman wants. And
Yes.
it's interesting in recovery, and we saw this at Sills, that pretty much every speaker said it's the it's the offender's responsibility to take the initiative for repair.
Mm.
And that kind of care and initiating, positive initiating, begins to take away that First Corinthians 6, that sort of obligation.
Yeah.
I think many Christian women are under that, oh, well, God says I have to submit to my husband. I have to give him. But it's interesting if you follow that. Paul says, do not deny each other except for a season of prayer. So what's the season of prayer for? The
Mm.
season of prayer is to find out what's wrong with me. What am I doing wrong? How do I repair that? How do I ask for forgiveness? How do I relate in a different way to my spouse so then we can reconnect? So
That's
it's
good.
not really about obligation, it's about healthy reconnection.
That's good. That's good. Um, one of the things you wrote was that renewed morality follows renewed spirituality. Um, Getting beyond the acts, beyond the behavior, and I'd just like you to unpack that specifically for a minute.
Well, one of the things we discover with guys in recovery is that we have gone through umpteen different episodes where we've said things like, I should never have done that. I'll never do that again. See, the moral voice comes in and says, that violates God's law. I should know better. I should know better as a Christian. All the shoulds. And talking about, I used to have a teacher who talked about the hardening of the arteries. And we
I love
ought to
that.
do this and we ought to do that. And it gets us nowhere because there's a kind of a psychological cycle which says if I blame myself enough, I can just go back and do it again. So what we need is a spiritual transformation where we're reconnecting with God, we're understanding the hope of the program, we're opening ourselves to others in honesty spiritually. And once we begin to make those spiritual connections, the morality piece kind of follows along behind.
Mm.
So we say, or I say, that sex addiction is not primarily a moral problem, it's a spiritual problem with moral consequences.
Wow.
But we have to get at the root. I'm going to have some surgery in August 1st. I won't go into the details of the surgery, but the surgeon said to me, we have to get to the root of the problem first, and then the secondary issue, which is one we need to look at, we can look at it, but we can't look at it until we deal with
Mm.
the core problem. And so we have to deal with this spiritual problem. Spirituality and sexuality are like this.
Yeah.
There, if you had a lightning rod on your house, the spirituality and the sexuality lightning rod would be very close together. And so when it's lightning strikes one, it goes to the other very easily.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but we have to deal with it as a spiritual problem because that's its nature.
Mm. For the guy or anyone who hears this and feels like that's too high a mountain to climb. I don't think I can get there. I'm too far gone, or whatever their, I'm going to say rationalization. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that you need to recognize that you are already a spiritual being. You don't have to become one. You are already one.
That's good.
The problem is that it's been overridden so much or suppressed or denied or rejected that it's like the hurting child within.
Mhm.
And so we have to somehow tend to that child, allow him to grow up, allow him to spread his wings, and to understand that God has a plan for happiness and connection and purpose that only our spirits can embrace.
Yeah.
And so they may have to go through a period of healing the trauma. I
Mhm.
mean, as you know, the all of this recovery stuff is going much more to the trauma model because we
Yes.
see this connection between the adult person and the child.
Yes.
And so um, I would recommend anybody to get involved in something that deals with the core trauma because as we begin to deal with that, then the spiritual nature that it was ours to begin with. And this is how when we look at children, we see that spiritual nature. See it in the things that they say, their
Mhm.
openness. And when you talk to them about God, they say, of course.
Yeah.
And all of that is there. But the problem is it gets crushed, it gets denied, it gets hurt. And we have to address that. And if we address that, then we begin to allow the spirit to soar, and it will.
Mm, beautiful. The whole paradigm that I hear you talking about is changing from the inside out. It's not forcing yourself or having other people force you into some external box. Like you were saying, Jesus cares about the heart. This is the model for how the heart changes, is what you're talking
Yes.
about.
Yes, and that's why we say to people, if you want to put Covenant Eyes on your computer, or you want to not get cable TV or not expose yourself, I think that can be smart at particularly in the early stages of
Yeah,
recovery.
yeah,
But it's not the ultimate answer because uh, we have to renew our minds. Romans 12:1 and 2.
yeah.
Once we begin to renew our minds, then the need for external restraint, the law, diminishes. So that's what we need to ultimately focus on. If those things give us room to do that, then so be it. But it's not a program of laws, it's a program of internal recovery and connection.
Mm, beautiful. Um, Jay, you do head up Living Without Lust. You've written a few books. We'll link to that in the show notes. And if you're looking at this by video under this video, talk just for a minute about what Living Without Lust does.
Well, our motto is we help men who struggle with lust and support the Christian leaders who serve them. So we kind of have a barbell approach. We deal with individual consultation. So if somebody calls us typically and says, this has happened, I've just disclosed to my wife, we're separated, or I've been fired from work for looking at porn, or I've been caught in a park downtown,
Mhm.
I don't know what to do. We say, okay, here are the things you need to look at. And so we talk about the four pillars of recovery. So if you don't know what to do these four things. You go away for a short-term workshop. We send people to Be Broken. We send them to Boulder Recovery
Mhm.
or Bethesda or one of these other ones
Yep.
to break the spell. Then suggest that they come back and undergo therapy because everybody's lust story is different.
Mhm.
So we come to understand our own lust story, and we also begin to find God in our lust story.
Yes.
And if we begin to find God in our lust story, then we begin to make sense of things. And the change then comes from the problem and the anguish to the purpose.
Mhm.
And it's only when we discover the purpose that we begin to fully recover. Then we ask them to get into 12-step recovery because every therapist I know says basically, I'm going to be done with you in X number of months or years, but you're never going to be done with this. You need fellowship, support, and ongoing program um, because of what's happened. And you're going to likely have this for a long time, if not the rest of your life. So you need to find that. And then if they're alone, which they often are because people find out and they lose their friends, they need some kind of Christian mentor who basically can check in with them, pray with them, take them out to lunch and say, you're going to be fine. And I'm going to walk through this with you. So
Mhm.
that's the individual consultation. Then the church stuff is essentially supporting pastors, educating them.
Yeah.
We've been into three theological seminaries, helping to equip the next generation because they're going to find this a lot when they go into the parish.
Yep.
Um, and having, we do Zoom seminars like this, books, tapes, an annual men's conference. We have the last 4 years we've had that, and then we appear at various other gatherings as like sills that have particular presentations or meet and greet opportunities for us to tell people about their work. So that's essentially what we do.
Well, thank you. And I just want to mention your book too, The Rest of God, Finding Freedom from Lust in the Internet Age. A couple of years old, but I found it enlightening myself. We'll link to that as well. Um, Jay, this has been an honor and many blessings to you and your work. May this heart transformation message grow. And may you and those who work with you be empowered to share this ever more broadly. Blessings to you.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for this opportunity and for the work you do and for us being able to work together and journey together down this road.
Amen, brother.
Thanks.
I so appreciated how Jay moved to the matters of the heart. Behaviors have consequences. Jay's behaviors had consequences for him and his family and his church and those he cared about, but he learned to get to the matters of the heart. I think that is always the journey that God calls us to, is to move to matters of the heart and address what's really there. And that's where the transformation God has available for you and me. That's where it starts, and that's where it needs to go. Jay mentioned several resources. Certainly, Living Without Lust. We'll link to that under this video. But he also mentioned Be Broken and Boulder Recovery and Bethesda. We'll link to those also under this video. Among other things, those organizations offer intensive on-site retreats where men or women can get some dedicated, deep, intensive help for dealing with sexual brokenness. We'll also link to a resource our ministry has available, Your Sexpectations online course about how to look at some of your story with honesty, invite Jesus into your story, and find the freedom to write the next chapter. One of the things that Jay's story illustrates is it's usually multiple things that you need if you find yourself stuck in something like sexual brokenness at a deep level. And part of what our heart is to both encourage and equip you with some things that can help you toward the kind of transformation God has for you. I would love to hear from you. Leave a message under this video or come to drcarolministries.com, the contact page there. You can leave a confidential message, and I respond myself. We also, every week, put out an article or similar resource. In addition to this podcast, something around dealing with matters of the heart, and often around intimacy, sexuality, relationships, just that whole world. Would love you to subscribe. Come over to our website, and it's easy for you to subscribe there to get our material weekly. And subscribe to this YouTube channel. If this has been helpful for you, subscribe and then tell a friend. And until next time, may God bless you.